Conversation with John Freeman, a writer and literary critic. Freeman is also the editor of Granta and the former president of the National Book Critics Circle. So Lionel will open tonight by reading for about 15 minutes, and then she and John will talk, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions. Let's welcome Lionel Shriver.
Good evening. Before we get going, I'm curious, how many people here have read something about this book ahead of time? And you still came. I'm afraid this is one of those novels that I thought was perfectly innocuous and has, despite itself, caused the usual stir. It's a novel that I that I finished in 1998, and I admit that in the author's note at the beginning. I did try to publish this novel when I finished it, but at the time my sales record was very poor, and furthermore, one of the central subjects of this novel was not especially central to American culture or politics, and that's terrorism. Well, time went on. The next book I wrote, We Need to Talk About Kevin, took care of the sales record problem. But by that time, there was a new one, and that was 9/11. You can imagine that publishing a book that was humorous, that was about terrorism, was absolutely impossible for a long time. And I've been hoping that the moratorium on books that have a sense of humor about this subject is finished. There have been reviewers who've informed me that I am incorrect. And I think, I actually believe that it's important that we re-achieve a sense of humor about this material. It is an assertion of the way we do things in this part of the world, where if you know how to do it, anything is funny, and anything is worthy of comedy if you can pull it off. That's my view. The main of the book takes place on a peninsula of Portugal that doesn't really exist, called Barba. I actually just took a map of Portugal and drew a little squiggly thing on the end of it, and that's my province, and it's sprouted a homegrown terrorist movement called the SOB. And my protagonist, Edgar Kellogg, used to be a lawyer, has recently retired from that profession in order to become a freelance journalist. He has long been the kind of person who conceives entrancements with people of his same sex. He's heterosexual, but he idolizes people. But he also hates himself for idolizing people because he thinks that this is a weakness. It takes him the whole book to learn that actually it's the nicest thing about him. The reason that he's drawn to journalism in the first place is that his friend Toby Falconer from high school, whom he utterly revered, also became a foreign correspondent for the newspaper, fictional newspaper, the National Record. And so once Edgar has been freelancing for a few months, he decides to hit his old friend up for a contact at the National Record. And the section I'm going to read you is from his job interview with Toby's editor, whose name is Guy Wallace. I've chosen a scene from very near the beginning of the book because the plot is rather complicated and we don't want to have to go through all that explanation. Only a handful read our international coverage, Wallace dismissed, with one exception. when our American everyman tucks the record under one arm and trundles into a 747 and one of those filthy little foreigners blows it up. Those articles get read, my friend, every column inch. Edgar found railing against terrorists the height of tedium. The issue invited over-obvious moralizing, since who's going to contend that wasting those 2 kids with a trash can bomb in a DC shopping mall in April was a profound political statement? Presumably, Edgar was now obliged to chime in with hearty indignation over the soldazis o Zatzis, or whatever those sorry-ass crackpots called themselves, clenching his fist in we shall not be moved solidarity with his fellow Americans who will never capitulate to terrorism. Or maybe he should small talk about how amazing it was that the FBI hadn't collared a single one of those dirtbags to demonstrate that he was on top of the story. But this interview wasn't going well. The application had been a long shot to begin with, and Edgar passed. So you quit law to become a freelance journalist, Wallaceck noted. What possessed you? Edgar paused. How could he ever explain to Guy Wallaceck that Edgar Kellogg was meant for something finer than drafting turgid corporate briefs? Or that he wanted to say something, when the very ache to say something, and not something in particular, must have put Edgar in the same boat as every other flailing schmuck in the country. I got bored, Edgar telescoped lamely. Writing for Amtrak Express amuses you more. Gotta start somewhere. And the law felt, I don't know, passive. We're parasites. Journalists are parasites, Wallace had countered, on everybody else's events. Plenty of scribblers spend their workdays merely recording what you just walked away from. Mergers and acquisitions, transfers of power and money. Worst thing that can happen to a correspondent is to start thinking of himself as a player. The hack who fancies himself a mover and shaker gets slipshod, thinks he's covering his own story. Reporting is a humble profession, Mr. Kellogg. Journalists, Wallaceck shrugged, are history's secretaries. Better history secretary than Philip Morris's lawyer, said Edgar. At least hacks get bylines. Law's an anonymous profession, behind the scenes. I'd like to distinguish myself. You want to see your name in print, said Wallaceck skeptically. I want to see anything in print that isn't solely composed to help some suit who already has more money than he knows what to do with make a little bit more. Edgar pressed on with a willful geekiness refreshingly unlike him. I want to get at the truth. The truth most reporters get at is pretty pedestrian. The Secretary of State left the White House at 5:40 p.m. and not at 6 o'clock. As for the big picture sort, Wallaceck took a moment to reflect and ran a dirty nail along the stitching of his jacket. I didn't used to camp behind a desk, Mr. Kellogg. Funny, I don't miss pounding the pavement much as I might have expected. I cut my teeth in Vietnam, hung up my hat after Grenada. I can't say for sure I have a better understanding of anything than the folks who stayed in bed. Damnedest thing. But you could be right there in the middle, 2 armies tearing each other apart, and afterwards not have one thing to say about it. Not one thing. Way it should be. A reporter's not supposed to chip in his 2 cents. But this failure to achieve perspective, it can be personally discouraging. There's no overarching truth out there. Only a bunch of menial, dissociated little facts. And the facts don't often add up to much. A lot of trees, not much forest. Oh, once in a rare while you trip over an All the President's Men and get to play the hero. But for the most part, you just find out what happened. And what happened is depressing. No more depressing than my law firm, said Edgar. I only wonder if your expectations aren't a mite steep. Not only of getting a staff job at this newspaper, but of what the job would entail if I were rash enough to offer a post to an inexperienced, middle-aged cub. Edgar could skip the fatherly advice, as well as being classed at only 37 as middle-aged. You're the one who asked me for an interview. Could have flipped my CV in the trash. Edgar reached for his briefcase. Wallaceck raised his palm. Hold your horses. The editor finally got to the point. I have a problem. Edgar's eyebrows shot up before they plowed into a more agreeable scowl. You up to speed on the Barban conflict? Asked Wallaceck. Though Edgar had scanned his share of headlines, who could miss them when they were 2 inches high? The SOB's cause had sounded so tiresome when the fringe group surfaced a few years ago that Edgar had happily added Barba to the growing list of too complicated and who gives a fuck shitholes about which Edgar refused to read, along with Bosnia, Angola, Algeria, and Azerbaijan. Before cramming current events to prepare for this interview, Edgar couldn't have pinpointed the jerkwater within 1,000 miles on the map. Never been there, said Edgar, but of course I've followed the story closely. Wallaceck rose and stretched, his thighs splayed as he perched chummily on the desk. The SOB has been lying low and the story may be played out. But some folks are convinced that this is an undeclared cessation, not because they're giving up, but because they're gearing up for something big. Thomas Freeman wrote in the Times last week that canny terrorists vary the pace of their campaign. For a while there, the Sops were blowing up a subway or an airplane like clockwork every 6 weeks or so. People can get used to anything. Pretty soon, you've got these miscreants going to all that trouble blowing stuff up, only to maintain the impression that nothing's new. Tom was ostensibly urging that we not get complacent about security, but I wasn't too sure about that column myself. Almost like Freeman giving those maniacs good tactical advice. It was Pavlovian. Wallaceck mentions Barba, and Edgar's mind wanders. In fact, Edgar had been musing how when the SOB first emerged in the news, everyone thought the name of the group was a laugh. Nowadays, even management types like Wallaceck cited the acronym with a straight face. You actually had to remind yourself that in olden times it meant son of a bitch. Point is, Wallaceck continued, any day now we could have another horror show splattered across the front page and the Record could be caught with its pants down. How's that? Wallaceck sucked his cheeks between his molars and chewed. He stood up. He jammed his hands in his pockets and jingled his keys. He glowered piercingly at his toes, as if trying to burn extra holes in his wingtips. Barrington Saddler. He didn't ask, have you heard of, or introduce, there's this fellow called. The editor simply plunked the name in the room like a heavy object he'd been lugging around and was relieved to chuck on the floor. Wallaceck himself gazed at a midpoint in the office, as if some large physical presence would manifest itself. The name put Edgar off from the start. The Barrington bit was overblown and beefy, and anyone who didn't have the wit to shorten the pretentious appellation down to Barry was a pompous ass. The tag evoked adjectives like overbearing and unbearable, and New Englanders would experience the irksome impulse to place the word great in front of it. Barrington Saddler was sent to Earth to try my personal patience, Wallaceck had resumed. Maybe it's because I'm still trying valiantly to pass God's test of my character that I haven't fired the man. That and because Saddler is supposedly one of our star reporters. I'll spare you the nitty-gritty unless someday you appear to need a cautionary tale. But Barrington was posted to Russia, where Barrington was banned. I could have axed him then, but his boosters would have put up a stink. And I do have this indefensible fondness for the lout. So I decided to exile him, and instead, I spread out a map of Europe and located the most far-flung, poorest, dullest corner of the continent. This worthless jut of Portugal hadn't rated passing mention in the American press for 200 years. I figured here was the perfect place for Saddler to contemplate the error of his ways. Here was the one place he'd never draw a crowd, another protective, gossipy clique that goads him into mischief. Because no one went there. No tourists, no expats, much less any of his journo buddies on assignment, because there was jack to cover, just a bunch of Iberian crackers babbling a language he'd be too lazy to learn, and good Catholic girls who keep their bodices buttoned. I'd keep him on salary until he learned his lesson, and he'd come back from this sandbox having got nothing in the paper all year, suitably chastened, and ready to play by the rules as one more humble steno in history's secretarial pool. And where is this podunk across the pond? Wallace charged ferociously. Barba, Edgar guessed. Barba, which within months of Saddler's arrival sprouts the single most lethal terrorist organization of the 20th century. Ever, I reckon. And there's Saddler, happy as a pig in shit, in the very center of the story, firing off front-page leads on the ultimatums of the SOB. A predictable cadre descends on the dump. The Times, the Post, and the Guardian now have permanent staffers in the provincial capital, Cinzero. Even the London Independent, which is terminally broke, keeps a string. Presto, Saddler's leading a hat pack again. I'd say the man is charmed, except that lately I've wondered if this cat is finally on life number 10. Saddler's in trouble. Maybe he cozied up to those murderous douchebags too close, I don't know. He's reckless. He thinks danger is funny. Anyway, 3 months ago he disappeared. Vanished, poof, gone. Practically left his coffee cooling and his camel burning. Which is where you come in. So what's the gig? Edgar pressed, forcing his leg to stop jittering. Wallace clapped his hands. I need a correspondent in Barba. I've given up waiting for Saddler to send flowers. So I'm offering you a string. There is a retainer, which technically makes you a super stringer. But don't let the heroic title go to your head. Our monthly gratuity will keep your tape recorder in fresh batteries, and that's about it. Flat rate, $400 an article, plus expenses, but only for the pieces we print. We'll pay your initial freight. No benefits. You can set yourself up in Barrington's digs. I gather he even left his car. But this arrangement would be provisional, Wallace barreled on before Edgar had a chance to say yes or no. Barrington's been on board this paper from its inception. He's an institution, if you like. If he shows up with an explanation I can even pretend to swallow, the posting's his again. He knows this story, been on it from the ground up. So Saddler shows up next week, your string is for 1 week. This was a big break, so Edgar's hesitation was absurd. The superstring paid peanuts, but had a spicy ring to it, and was a foot in the door. Maybe sometime soon, 245 civilians would make him a lucky man. Death toll in hundreds as SOB claims sabotage of United Flight 161 by Edgar Kellogg, Barba correspondent. Still, something about the setup oppressed him. Whoever Saddler was, sight unseen, the guy clearly belonged to the elite exception to every rule club, whose members cast the sort of shadow in which Edgar had lived all his life. Furthermore, Edgar was leery of substituting for a minor league celeb who could show up unannounced any time to reclaim his home, his car, his beat, his half-smoked camel, and his cold coffee. I guess I'm game, said Edgar uncertainly. How soon should I go? ASAP. And here, Walsek scribbled an address, which he apparently knew by heart. Saddler's Digs. He held out a sheet of paper, adding obscurely, "You won't suffer." Edgar accepted the paper. So how do I book a flight, submit a receipt, we'll reimburse? Wallace said yada yada. Oh, and one more thing. The editor thumbed a furry leather contact book on his desk, then snatched the paper back to scrawl a number. You might get a key to the house from Nicola, one of Saddler's friends. His very best friend, from all reports. I've never met her, but it's funny how often Saddler's numerous friends turn out to be good-looking women. A red flag went up. After spending 10 seconds on the logistics of Edgar's whole new life, and 45 minutes on this feckless cad playing hooky, Wallaceck still couldn't stop talking about Saddler. Edgar folded the paper. So, what's my first assignment? The strange and terrible fate of Barrington Saddler. What else? There's only one.
Is there only one in my...
No.
Sorry about that. It's really nice to be here with Lionel, who's one of my favorite living novelists, because she continues to rub us the wrong way, which is, I think, is a way of just telling stories that question kind of dominant narratives about everyday life, like healthcare, snooker, love, terrorism, and so I love this novel, and I think it's been written about as a satire of terrorism. But I wonder, Lionel, is it more of a satire of the symbiotic relationship between terrorism and journalism?
Well, of course, it's about a lot of things, and in this case, it's not only about terrorism and journalists and that symbiotic relationship, but as you can tell from what I read, it's also about the cult of personality, the myth of charisma. What is it about certain people who, if they don't come to your party, the party's going to be a drag? I mean, it's something that inevitably interests novelists. You know, the big character, the larger than life type. So, and that topic makes the book work perhaps more than terrorism. But along the way, it does make a lot of observations, and one of them is about the symbiotic relationship between journalists and terrorists. Journalists give what Margaret Thatcher used to call the oxygen of publicity to terrorism, and without that publicity, terrorism doesn't work. The problem is that to solve that, what do? Do you bring in censorship? Do you tell journalists that they can't cover 9/11 because that's going to magnify the effect of that event? Well, that's not realistic, is it? There's a similarly symbiotic relationship between journalists and school shooters, which of course I've written about in We Need to Talk About Kevin. One of the things that motivates, I believe indeed the main thing that motivates school shooters, is imagining the kind of press that they're going to get. Their face on TV, their name in the paper, long op-eds worrying about their terrible problems. And terrorists, too, thrive on attention and probably have that more as their immediate goal than whatever they say they're doing it for. But I don't think censorship works. I don't think that in a supposedly free country we should have it, and I honestly don't know what the answer is. Margaret Thatcher actually brought in, they have censorship in the UK. They don't have a constitution, so there's, you don't violate the First Amendment. And she brought in a regime where it was illegal to broadcast Jerry Adams' voice. He was head of Sinn Féin and effectively the head of the IRA. what did broadcasters do? They broadcasted the pictures of long interviews with Jerry Adams on TV, but they turned the sound off, and then they brought in an actor who would fill in everything that Adams said. And they deliberately found people who had Northern Irish accents, and by the end of this farce, they had located people who could do a perfect imitation of his voice. You know, it made the government look ridiculous. So, you know, the journalists and terrorists of every stripe need each other, and I honestly don't know what the answer is. The only small thing I have done is that I used to be dragged onto radio and TV shows all the time, every time some school was shut up. And since one of the things that I would say on these programs is, look, these kids are looking for publicity. And there I was giving them that very publicity. I had to catch myself on and decide that my doing that kind of program was hypocritical. And so the one small thing I have done is retire as a rent-a-quote for school shootings.
Well, the other thing that this novel sort of does is propose that ridicule is another option. Early in the novel, there's a kind of discussion. I think it's inside of Edgar's head, where he thinks that everything you think of about a person, let's say they're generous, you can create a sort of negative inverse. So if they're generous, they are weak. If they're funny, they're mean-spirited. If they're attractive, they're wily. And you can kind of go through any kind of characteristic that way.
Yeah, he calls it inversion.
Inversion. I feel like this novel does an inversion on terrorism, because basically what you have is terrorists who are incompetent and instead of being ubiquitous and dangerous are sort of scattered and unorganized, and you have journalists who normally we think of as truth tellers as liars. Is that sort of the basis for this satire, or am I mischaracterizing it?
Well, I do think that humor is the ideal weapon against terrorists. And a good example of that is the underpants bomber. I think being known as the underpants bomber is the perfect revenge. I mean, can you imagine how embarrassing it is for him in prison now with that tag? And you know, you can't even talk about the underpants bomber with a straight face. Brilliant, you know, and I find people who are attracted to terrorism are unbelievably humorless themselves and defenseless against being laughed at. It's the ultimate kryptonite, as far as I can tell. Oh, I wonder, have any of you seen this film, Four Lions?
Yeah,
You've seen it.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah.
You liked it.
I know.
You too.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Yes, did you like it? Did you laugh? I thought it was hilarious.
A lot of people are uncomfortable with it though in Britain.
Yeah.
They didn't like it. It split people.
Well, if you're going to be all sensitive and touchy-feely, I guess it is potentially either offensive or incendiary. I think what makes people nervous is, how can you broadcast that? You'll upset them again. Are the rest of you familiar with the film?
No.
It's about a hapless crew of Islamic terrorists in Sheffield, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's in Sheffield. And they're terrible at it. And it takes on every cliche of, you know, doing the video beforehand and everything. And it's very, very funny. And in some ways I think much more effective than a straight, you know, these are the villains, these terrible people. They're the heroes in a stupid way. And I was really glad to see that film come along, because that's what they can't take. I strongly recommend to you to get that film. It's on Netflix.
After the scene you read, Edgar goes to meet up with Toby Falconer, who went to high school with. Toby was the golden boy. Edgar was the overweight kid who managed to lose 100 pounds in a year by eating only celery. He was ridiculed mercilessly, and so he has this affection bordering on obsession with Toby, and Toby has actually gotten him this job interview. And a lot of your novels, and we talked about this once before, that there's kind of a splitting of two ways of living. And in the post-birthday world, it's two men to choose from. In some ways, in what we talk about, we need to talk about Kevin, it's two visions of motherhood. And I wondered, is Toby in any way, because he turns out not to be a bad guy, to have basically had a family and a kind of less exciting life than Edgar could have ever imagined, is he kind of another version of another life of a journalist that Edgar could have had? I mean, because he's basically looking at Barrington, the giant, charismatic, world-traveling correspondent, and then there's the guy who grinds it out at the paper, goes home to his family.
Well, those two images have to do with reality and then magnification, what we make of reality, what we make into it. The people who become icons for us, are they really that great? Or is that us projecting onto them what we want to see? The character of Toby is all the magnification stripped away. Edgar meets his old high school idol, and he's losing his hair, and he doesn't have any of the flash that Edgar remembers. But one of the things you're supposed to reflect on is maybe Toby Falconer never really had all the flash that Edgar remembers. That a lot of that was seeing what he wanted to see. And the other thing that the book looks at later is, what is it like to be someone whom other people look up to, whom other people magnify and project on? Isn't it a little lonely? Don't you feel like secretly a bit of a fraud? There's a line in the chapter you're remembering, the one that follows this, in which Toby Falconer says, "No such thing as larger than life, Kellogg. There's only life size, and any magnification is other people's bullshit."
A lot of this book takes place in conversation in a bar called the Rat in the town where Edgar goes in Barba. There's several other journalists who are very well described, so well described. I'm kind of tempted to ask you if they're based on real people. But how much of this book drew out of your own experiences as a journalist, working in Belfast, or I think you lived in Israel too, another country?
Actually, the experience of living in the midst of a hack pack was less from Belfast, where I lived for 12 years, than Nairobi, where I lived over a year when I was working on game control. And I happened to live in a house with 3 other foreign correspondents. I wasn't a foreign correspondent. I was a lowly little fiction writer. And this connected me to the entire insular little world of foreign correspondents who all hung out with each other, and they all had parties together, and they all had offices in the same building, which I used in this book. And it was an ambivalent experience because it was a little disillusioning. Some of them were horribly pompous. But on the other hand, I was very envious of them, because I was staying back in the house working on my novel every day, and I did a few interviews that got me out of the house, but otherwise, you know, no one was paying my expenses, and I wasn't hopping airplanes to Somalia, and they had great stories to tell, and all I could report is, you know, what I had for lunch. I was really jealous of their lives. And looking back on that, though the novel does take the mickey out of foreign correspondence to a degree, I have since become much more overtly admiring the foreign correspondence again, because lately the entire profession appears to be endangered, and I'm very attached to newspapers. I am a news junkie with television. I need these people, and their ranks are being thinned. They're getting paid less. I'm worried that the entire apparatus of news gathering is going to disappear during my lifetime. And so now I feel a little bit sheepish about having given them a hard time in this novel, because I do think that they, even if they're not personally always heroes, they do perform a heroic function. And so now I want to stick up for them.
In this section, it's a very nice section that you read, because you can pull out almost all the themes of the book. And one of which is it possible to see a kind of narrative from the forest in the midst of news? And after stepping back now for many years, you still write for the Guardian and for other newspapers. And you're outside of that kind of realm of journalism. Do you feel like that journalism tells us anything? Is it more than history's secretary, or is it essential in a way that that this book is sort of nodding at with its time?
Well, of course, there are different kinds of journalism, and the kind that I do is not as essential, I think, for the running of civilization. I write comment pieces, and I do reviews, that kind of thing. Certainly, the purpose of writing comment pieces is to come up with more of a perspective, and put the, as Wallace says, the menial, dissociated little facts together in a pattern that makes some kind of sense. I think one of the things that motivated me to write this novel was having been living in Northern Ireland for coming up on a dozen years, and while I had written lots of op-eds, mostly for the Wall Street Journal, about this and that little turn of the wheel in Northern Irish politics, I hadn't got to put the pieces together and look at the big picture. And most importantly, the big picture was that in Northern Ireland, terrorism worked. It worked a treat. It got the IRA virtually everything it wanted. It didn't quite close the deal on a united Ireland, but they at least got in place the sequence by which they might achieve that. In meantime, they're running the place. And even in an incremental way, all the things that the Catholic community had been complaining about that kicked the troubles off, like unequal housing and poor employment opportunities, all that got completely turned around. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm glad that Catholic areas got good housing. I'm glad that employment became fairer. In fact, it all went the other direction, and the Catholic areas had much better houses and more leisure centers, and there was what's called positive discrimination, so that Catholics got better opportunities at jobs. Well, whatever you think of that, the reason why all this changed was bad. The reason was terrible. It was all because of the IRA and a campaign of bombing the mainland and shooting soldiers and policemen and blowing up buildings in the town where I lived. This was not what we want to see pay off. the moral of this story is that terrorism works, and somehow we have to stop responding in the way that we're supposed to. In the most immediate way for you, I mean, you don't have to have lived in Northern Ireland to get the feeling for how effective this strategy is. All you have to do is get on an airplane. Every hour you lose to a security queue is a victory for terrorism. Every time you take off your shoes, which is it's humiliating, is a victory for terrorism. Richard Reed is smiling, you know? So we have allowed these people to contort the way we live our lives. And I find this forbidding.
There's an uncanny feeling reading this book, knowing that it was written in 1998 and now it's 2012, because it does in some ways prefigure not just the sort of ubiquity of terrorism, but the pat-downs at the airports that Edgar has to go through in order to get to Barba. Is incredibly reminiscent of my flight to Iowa last weekend. And reporters making up stories, which, you know, 4 years ago was everything that people were talking about, was how truthful is the truth. While this book was sitting there cooling, and you presumably picked it back up again and again, did you ever have the urge to change anything, or did you ever find yourself thinking, this is very strange because this is now happening?
Well, funnily enough, I didn't have to change anything. I did make a global decision that while I tightened it up a little bit, that I wouldn't change it in a substantive way. And most of all, I would not insert prescient little observations in view of the current political climate. There were plenty of prescient little observations in it already, so why bother? I actually had a reviewer at the Globe and Mail recently suppose that surely I made up the politics of Barba after the fact, that I must have doctored that. And that's because the cause that the SOB is exercised about is Muslim immigration from North Africa. Muslim immigration from North Africa and the Middle East into Europe has, of course, become a huge issue since I wrote the book. But I knew it would be. I knew it would become only a bigger issue. I'm an amateur demographer. The growth rates in that part of the world are enormous. The immigration coming into Europe from the Middle East and North Africa was bound to keep skyrocketing, and they're Muslims, and I saw trouble coming a long time ago. So the Globe and Mail was wrong. I didn't insert that after the fact. I just anticipated that in the 90s.
One of the threads throughout the book is the way that success and attention can change you. You know, Barrington went off to Barba, and I don't want to give away much of the plot, but he did obviously run away with the idea of the attention he could get as a reporter, and something similar to some degree happens to Edgar as he goes there and starts running down the rabbit hole in search of Barrington, and at some point even imagining his own conversations with Barrington's ghost, a la Hamlet. In context of your own work, you know, you published 6 novels, I think, before Kevin, and you were, as you said, your sales were poisonous, and suddenly you've got a multi-million, I assume at this point, bestseller, and you can live in a different way. Has the removal of those pressures changed the nature of what you write or how you write? Is there any sort of need for that that feeling of being on the margin in order to write the way that you have for so long?
I guess we'll find out. I mean, I have produced how many books? Post-birthday?
11.
No, but after Kevin.
This is your, at least 2, right?
Yeah, well, I've written 3 books since Kevin. and I've just about finished a fourth. And then there's this one, which doesn't count. So I am obviously continuing to produce. I think that the books are still of a reasonable caliber. But I probably am not wholly comfortable with doing well. I got used to frustration and having to fight for attention rather than fight it off. And
do you find yourself relating to that sense of that you mentioned of being a fraud or just distrusting people's attention at all? Or
I do find other people's admiration of me embarrassing, and it makes me feel self-conscious. It certainly makes me worry about whether I am a fraud. You know, that comes with the territory. It's not as fun as I would have expected. I would have to say that, and you don't. I deal with this in my next book a little bit, but it's something that people who do well, they keep to themselves because it doesn't come across very well. You know, the last thing other people want to hear is you complaining about how successful you are. But it isn't as rich in some ways as failure. Failure is emotionally powerful, and maybe is often a big drag, but it also involves anger and frustration and exasperation and determination. They're big, powerful emotions, whereas success is just, that's nice. Oh, okay. Well, that's nice, I get to go business class. There's no resistance, and the emotions are actually very, very mild. And that's what I don't like about it, the mildness. If it's not mild, then it's gone to your head, and that's even worse.
Final question before I open up to questions from you guys. Edgar is another sort of long line of characters that you've written who are, for lack of a better word, hard to like. He's aggressive. He takes any gift given to him and sort of finds a way to kind of be thankless for it or ungrateful. And I wonder if is this one of the reasons why you write characters like this? Characters because failure is richer, because anger is somehow more compelling.
Well, a lot of negative traits are more interesting than positive ones. Someone who's grateful is maybe easy to like, but ingratitude is more interesting. Why? Why would he be ungrateful? And of course, that's explored a little in that third chapter that you're talking about. I like making characters that are hard to like because then I set myself a challenge, and I think that I'm hoping that by the end of this book you actually come to like Edgar, that he wins you over, partly because the things that he does that aren't a very good idea don't work out well at all. And you come to understand that somebody who was a fat kid might have a chip on his shoulder, might be wary of other people. I mean, I find that negative traits are richer because they need explaining. And once you understand them, you may not approve of them, but you can see this person more completely from the inside. And I realize I run the risk of writing a character that you plain dislike and therefore are not interested in and don't want to read about. And that is always the risk of characters that are a little difficult. But I think that if you are willing to go along with them to begin with, there's a greater payoff. I also just think they're more realistic characters. You know, not only am I bored by writing about paragons, but I've never met one.
Well, thank you for that. I love it. This book feels like a sun. The sun also rises for our time. It's the one book no one's mentioned in the reviews. Everyone talks about Scoop and Conrad, but you know, this would be the obvious one because it's sort of even on the same peninsula, theoretically.
I actually hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, no, it's a love story, except nothing. Anyway, thank you, Lionel. Does anybody have any questions for Lionel about the book or the previous books?
I was curious, because it's been 14 years since you had written this book, when you reapproached it again with the eyes of 14 years more experience and having written several other novels in the interim, did you feel like that was a different Lionel in '98 versus, and your abilities have grown since then? And was there anything that you felt, aside from just tweaking, you had to really take out a big monkey wrench towards? Or?
No, I didn't. And I didn't think, oh, I've changed so much, I don't write that way anymore. It's more the case that this particular book is written with a slightly different style than my other ones. It's more of a thriller. It's definitely a boy book, and that style is quite distinctive. There have been reviewers who mistake that as, oh, I used to be a different kind of writer or a worse writer, and now I've developed. No, this book has particular conventions. You could tell from the conversation I read, it's not like all my other dialogue. And therefore, I recognize that this book has a certain essential nature which I would not want to alter. And it works in its own terms. It's not entirely written in the realistic tradition. I've got it in the neck for, you know, having some things in this book that are implausible, but because it's a novel that, you know, makes up the place, it makes up the weather, it makes up the agriculture. It's a little bit like saying, well, I don't like The Wizard of Oz because, you know, houses don't fly through the air like that. You know, it's not strictly speaking, it's more allegory rather than gritty realism. And it's fun, it's playful. And I didn't want to alter that nature. It already had its own nature. So it was more a matter of getting rid of some adjectives.
Thank you.
Yes?
Where did you get the idea for Barba from? Do you have any particular way where you get ideas for what novels you're going to write, or do they just come to you like complete?
Oh, there's usually some core idea that triggers the book, and then of course then you have to build all around it, and you have to make a whole story. And if you read this book, you'll discover what that idea is. There's a twist in the middle of the book, which I doubt you will anticipate. And I will not tell you, unlike some reviewers. But the twist, that was the idea, right? And that's what gave me the rest of the book. With Kevin, for example, I knew I had an idea for a book. I had vaguely thought that I was interested in doing something with the school shooting thing, because when I was first entertaining the notion of that novel, nobody had written about it. We forget that because there have been so many since. And I knew it would attract fiction writers. It's such a natural subject. But it was when I thought of the idea of telling the story from the mother of the killer that's when I knew that was a real book idea. So, and where do they come from? I really haven't a clue. I would say that reading the newspaper is a big part of my daily inspiration. That's one reason I'm so concerned with their going away.
You made a comment that a critic took you to, or said you must have doctored the detail of terrorism coming
Muslim
from
immigration
right.
into Europe. Yeah.
Being that it's a novel and not a piece of journalism, is that even a relevant criticism?
I guess it's relevant if if I'm making a bid to be recognized as having been prescient. And in some ways, I guess I am.
When the book came out, the reviewers knew that it was something that had actually been written in '98.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm now really torn as to whether or not that was a good idea. Primarily because people have this weird attitude about something being old, right? Oh, it's old. Well, so is Dickens, right? So is Tolstoy. They're old. This is only 14 years old, but I've got some stick for that. But frankly, one of the reasons that I put up front that this is a book from 1998 is not just that I'm so truthful, it's also that I wanted credit.
I don't blame you.
Right? I was writing about terrorism before it was fashionable. And therefore I didn't want you to come to this book thinking, oh God, Shriver's writing about terrorism. Isn't that a little late in the day? I mean, Shriver has to write about terrorism like everyone else. It's more, no. I was on this issue a long time ago, and nobody, and it didn't pay off because being ahead of your time doesn't ever pay off. So in that sense, yes, I do think it's important that if I want that credit, then I can't have doctored the book too much, and it is best to set the record straight on things like the immigration thing, that no, I didn't add that after the fact.
Between your own books, do you have like a personal favorite? Kevin is always so spoken about, and I loved it, but I think I love Post-Birthday World more. So, I mean, what do you have a personal favorite, or is it just the one you're writing and then you go on to the next?
I'm not sure. I think it changes. I have been asked this before, and I usually say Game Control, with which the New Republic has a lot in common. If you've read my earlier books, then you realize that the New Republic is not as great a departure from my other work as it might otherwise seem, because if you've only read Kevin and After, it's like, God, where'd this come from? But in fact, Game Control, which takes place in Africa, and it's about a renegade demographer, has the same big, I guess what I call high concept. The twist I was talking about, where there's a twist in Game Control as well. I think I tend to cite that book partly because I just feel it's underappreciated, and is probably one of the books that people have least often read, and so I like drawing attention to it. Whether it's my favorite or my best, gosh, I haven't read it in many years, so I really can't say. I have a lot of affection for Post-Birthday, and that book does occupy a very special place in my heart. I like, I'm often characterized as being such a hard ass, but that book is very warm, and I like that, and I think that may be one reason that people like you respond to it. I don't think it's sentimental, but it's got a lot of heart in it, and I like that.
Oh, what is your new book about?
Fat.
Oh,
Actually, the one unfortunate thing about publishing The New Republic now is that Edgar Kellogg, my protagonist, was a fat kid. And it means that my subject matters are running up against each other in a way that I rue. But I wanted to write about obesity in a much more serious way. I used it in The New Republic just by way of explaining why Edgar is so defensive and leery of other people and inclined to think ill of them, because he grew up around people who were wary of him and inclined to think ill of him. You know, it's reactive. So I was just using that as a backstory. It's not that I'm completely obsessed with weight, or no more than everyone else around me. But I wanted to do a much more serious novel about that subject, and I'm almost finished. Anyone else?
Well, thank you.
Oh, thank you, Lionel Shriver.
Thank you.